One thing that Missourians, not just Kansas Cityans, not just those of you in counties that include Kansas City, Missouri proper, but the entire state of Missouri is going to be voting on this Amendment 4 coming up tomorrow. And this is to fully fund the KCPD, the police department, to the tune of 25% of the general fund. This was spearheaded 2.5 years ago by our next guest, State Senator Tony Luetkemeyer in Platte and Buchanan counties. You voted on it as a Missourian almost 2 years ago, but it's back on the ballot. Tony, good morning. First off, why is it back on the ballot, and why is it important for Missourians to get out there and vote for it?
Pete, thanks for having me back on the show. So as your listeners will recall, in 2022, Amendment 4 passed overwhelmingly, actually in every single county in the state. And after the vote, the mayor of Kansas City, Quentin Lucas, brought a lawsuit to overturn the will of over 1 million Missouri voters based on what he claimed was a mistaken fiscal note that accompanied the ballot question. Now, it's interesting. The fiscal summary was actually written by then Democratic State Auditor Nicole Galloway, and the mayor knew about the alleged issue before the election, but he waited until after the vote to challenge it. And so what he was doing is trying to get a second bite at the apple, which is what he got. And in a split decision, the Missouri Supreme Court, 4-3, sided with the mayor and ordered a new election. And so the ballot question that's going to be on Tuesday will be the same language that voters saw in 2022, just with a modified fiscal note. And in terms of why it's important to vote for this, as you noted, I filed this legislation in response to attempts in 2021 by the city of Kansas City to defund the KCPD to the tune of over $42 million. And what Amendment 4 does is it prevents future radical attempts by big city mayors to defund our police. We've seen a wave of violent crime sweep across Missouri, and at this critical time, we need to make sure we are supporting our men and women in law enforcement, and that is exactly what a yes vote on Amendment 4 does.
So it sounds like it was pretty well-timed, slippery politics by Quentin Lucas to try to get this second bite at the apple. Is that my correct understanding of this?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there was a letter that the mayor sent to Nicole Galloway prior to the election identifying what he believed was the mistake in the fiscal note. And then he said, but I'm going to wait until after the election to challenge it. So rather than bringing that challenge before the election, he sought instead to sandbag and get a second bite at the apple. And he was successful at doing that.
All right. So now Missourians go to the polls and take us through. This is to make sure that the police department is funded to the tune of 25%, a minimum of 25% of the general fund. It used to be 20. This gets it up to 25, which is where things currently are, correct?
That's exactly right. And so the minimum funding threshold for the KCPD was set by state statute back in 1954. It has not been adjusted from that 20% number during that entire period of time. And so in 2022, I passed a companion bill along with Amendment 4 that raised the minimum funding for the Kansas City Police Department from 20 to 25%. Now, 25% is the amount that the police department has been funded at in recent decades. And so when we saw the mayor and the city council in 2021 strip $42 million from the police department, what they were doing was they were stripping that extra 5% and lowering it down to the 20% threshold that had been in place since 1954. And so what this does is it stabilizes funding for the KCPD to make sure they have the resources they need to keep our community safe.
Tony Luetkemeyer, Platte Buchanan County State Senator, is on KCMO Talk Radio 95.7 FM. For people who might have short-term memories and they say, well, come on, the city council funded it this year to the tune of 25%. What is there to worry about, Tony Luetkemeyer? Leave this up to the city council, to the people of Kansas City. Why should the rest of Missouri be voting on it? What say you?
Well, I mean, in terms of, why, people should care still about it, if the mayor had no intentions of defunding the police in the future, the city council had no intentions of defunding the police in the future, why would they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars litigating this issue over the last 2 years? Clearly, they have intentions to hit the repeat button and do what they did in 2021. And so that's why it's so important still to get out and vote in favor of Amendment 4. In terms of why the rest of the state should care, I think that it's important to know that, Missourians all have a stake in public safety in Kansas City. It is the largest city in Missouri. The Kansas City Police Department is the largest police department in the state. And the lawlessness that would come from the KCPD being defunded, it affects the entire state. We cannot allow the largest city in Missouri to become the next Seattle or Portland. And that's why it is so important for all Missourians to come together, as they did in 2022, and make clear that we support our men and women in law enforcement, that we oppose radical big city mayors trying to defund them. And that's exactly what a yes vote on Amendment 4 means. It's a vote to back the blue and support our men and women in law enforcement.
So as much as anything, Tony, this is really a hedge against a wacko potential Kansas City City Council at some point in the future.
Yeah, and it's not far-fetched. Again, we saw this in 2021 when the police department had, $42 million stripped from it by the Kansas City City Council, the exact same city council, the exact same mayor that we're talking about right now. And again, if they had no intentions of defunding the police again, why spend all this money on lawsuits? Why spend the last 2 years fighting this in court? And the answer is very simple. They want to do this again, but they want to make sure that the legal landscape has changed so that they can do it and make sure that it sticks. And so that's why all Kansas Cityans, everyone in Missouri, needs to make sure and vote for Amendment 4 so we do not have our police department being defunded by these radicals.
All right. Tony Luetkemeyer, in the next minute, are you endorsing in the governor's race, by the way? I meant to ask you.
Yeah, so I'm supporting Mike Kehoe, our current lieutenant governor. Mike has been a good friend of mine for a long time. He's a small business owner. He's signed, both sides of a paycheck. He's endorsed by the Missouri Chamber of Commerce and a lot of our other pro-business groups. He's a first-generation family farmer. He has been endorsed by the Missouri Farm Bureau and all the other major agricultural groups in the state. He's also pro-law enforcement. He's the only governor candidate that's come out and endorsed Amendment 4, which I think is really important. He stands with our men and women in law enforcement, and he's the only candidate endorsed by the Missouri Fraternal Order of Police. And so I'm proudly standing with Mike Kehoe for governor on Tuesday.
All right, Tony Luetkemeyer. Thank you so much, Tony, and we'll be following, and we always appreciate the time.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks for having me.
You bet. That is Tony Luetkemeyer on KCMO Talk Radio 95.7 FM, streaming on the KCMO Talk Radio app.